I only want the content of the text translated, without any explanation or indication. The stop clock did not match the times recorded in the initial report, and that was just the beginning. When I arrived at the office where the man was found, everything seemed superficially in order. The body rested in a position suggesting he had fallen backward, with no visible signs of struggle, no traces of external violence, as if something as simple as a sudden fainting or a heart attack had been the cause. However, the clock showed a time several hours before the moment when the fatal event was estimated to have occurred. It was strange, because at first glance it seemed that the clock had stopped right during the fall, but when compared to preliminary reports, the discrepancy was too large. Then I wondered what was really happening. Why was that clock, such a small and common piece, giving me such a contradictory clue? I approached the clock carefully, picked it up gently, and examined it like someone trying to decipher a riddle engraved on its face. The second hand was still, pointing at 8:14 p.m., while the police documents indicated that the body was discovered around 11:30 p.m. How could it be that the clock had stopped hours before anyone noticed the situation? Had the deceased not been in that office during that time? My instinct began to ignite. There was more than met the eye. I decided to dig a little deeper and asked the officers in charge of the scene to allow me to review the building's CCTV records. There were cameras in the victim's workplace. But curiously, the footage from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. had some recordings erased or damaged. This was unusual, especially given that it was a work environment where security should be perfectly recorded. So there was an apparently clean scene, but with a rather murky edge. In the exact moment when the clock stopped, there was a void of audiovisual information. The feeling of discomfort grew as I investigated further. The man, named Esteban Contreras, a businessman known in some circles for his work in technology and finance, had no open enemies, and nothing seemed to indicate that anyone wanted to harm him. But a detail started to emerge in conversations with his colleagues and close acquaintances. In the last week, he had shown some anxiety, spoke of feeling watched, and being afraid of something he couldn't explain. These testimonies made me think that perhaps this accident was not such, and that behind it there could be a more complex, deeper story. Upon returning to morgue, I began a meticulous examination of the body, the tissues, the organs, every internal sign. A heart attack could be evident from blockages or damage. A fall showed fractures or bruises, but Esteban's body had none of that. There were no wounds, no external signs of violence, nor internal ones that justified a sudden death. But what really caught my attention was something most might overlook: the contents of the stomach. In the autopsy, when analyzing the gastric contents, I found traces of food that, according to his colleagues and family, Esteban had not consumed that day. Also, the amount and state of digestion in the stomach did not match the last meal he was supposedly having. This led me to think about internal timings, how the body metabolizes and processes what we ingest, and how that can tell a story by itself, a story that could contradict initial impressions. The combination of the stop clock, missing footage, and stomach contents indicated that Esteban had died earlier than declared. But how? And what had happened between the moment the clock stopped and the time he was found? The gap between these data opened an abyss of unanswered questions, which made me double my focus and patience in the investigation. The next clue came when I examined microscopic traces in Esteban's nails and hands. I found small particles of a strange, fine powder that did not correspond to typical office dirt nor remnants from his work environment. I sent that powder to the lab for chemical analysis. When I received the results, I was surprised to learn that it was a substance used in the technology industry for polishing and cleaning electronic devices. However, it was not a common powder, but an extremely hard-to-get technological variant, usually handled only by technicians specialized in delicate repairs. This led me to conclude that Esteban might have been conducting or involved in some delicate or risky activity related to advanced technology, perhaps outside his known activities. Cross-referencing this information with the deceased's personal data led me to discover that weeks before, he had attended a secret meeting with a small group of people at a technological innovation center, a gathering of which little was officially known, and from which Esteban emerged very nervous and cautious. Suddenly, all the pieces started fitting into a darker pattern than anyone expected. It was not simply an accident, but possibly a carefully planned crime seeking to hide evidence by manipulating time and physical details, so it appeared to be a natural ending. The stop clock marking a key hour, the strange powder on his hands, the lack of visual records in the building, the inconsistency of the stomach contents, and the false declared time of death revealed a meticulous operation to mislead investigators and possibly protect the real culprits. I felt the tension rising. It was not just a death. It was a story woven with invisible threads, a web of secrets and lies that had time as its accomplice. I then decided to delve even deeper into the personal items found in his office. I reviewed papers, agendas, emails downloaded on devices that seemed to have been deliberately erased. But my experience taught me to seek and find what others discard or ignore as insignificant. That's when I discovered a small notebook hidden behind a filing cabinet, almost invisible. In its pages, Esteban had written cryptic numbers, fragmented phrases, and references to something called Project Argos. I knew that name was not just anything. It connected to rumors about clandestine investigations in the tech area, secret projects linked to powerful companies with hidden interests. Each line in the notebook seemed like a warning, a call to be careful, as if Esteban knew he was in danger and tried to leave clues to ensure someone could uncover the truth if he didn't make it out alive. As I read, I understood a crucial aspect I had initially overlooked. His death was not an end, but a midpoint in an even bigger story. A story where time, that element which seemed so simple and everyday, was actually a silent witness to conspiracies and secrets. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of conviction and responsibility. That night, sitting in the laboratory shadows, with only the dim light from the screens and the lamp where I examined the notebook, I realized that the details that seemed minimal had the power to transform a common investigation into a complex odyssey. Every movement, every hint we ignore, can be a key piece to unveiling the truth, even when it seems sealed. I decided to return to the scene, this time accompanied by a more specialized team, to calmly and patiently review every corner, every possible trace, every shadow that could shed light. Because a stop clock not only marks a frozen time, but also a moment when life and death begin to tell hidden stories. And in that instant, I understood that sometimes it is not the body that speaks, but that which surrounds and envelopes in the final scene. Every little detail that, if we know how to listen, can guide us to what is still to be discovered. We returned to Esteban's office the next day, with a better prepared team and the intention of leaving no stone unturned. Entering that space for the second time gave me a strange mix of familiarity and unease. There was a heavy silence, charged with unanswered questions, and every time I looked at the clock stopped on the wall, 2014 remained like a mark that had not only stopped its hands, but also the logic of the case. We took our time, went through drawers and filing cabinets, photographed every corner with ultraviolet light, searched for fingerprints that seemed minimal or that even the investigators who had been there before might not have noticed. The environment felt like a time capsule, frozen with secrets. While the team worked, I went back to Esteban's notebook that I had brought with me that night. Every line scattered across those pages was a manuscript of alarm and contained paranoia, not just numbers and formulas, but also sketches and diagrams that looked like maps of invisible routes, interconnected points with acronyms I didn't immediately recognize. There were mentions of unexpected failures, unknown surveillance, red protocol, and the most disturbing, references to a person identified only by the initials LT. I tried to search his close circle to find out who it could correspond to, but nothing clear emerged. The only thing that seemed certain was that it had to do with the secret project, something that had become an obsession for Esteban in his last days. As the investigation progressed, we discovered an unexpected detail. A small hidden camera in the room, almost imperceptible, located in a corner hidden behind an artificial plant. This camera had recording capability with local storage, and it seemed to have been installed to capture the activity in that office. But what concerned us was that, as with the main cameras in the building, the footage from the last few hours was also erased except for a few minutes before 2000 hours, when Esteban entered hurriedly with a folder under his arm. Who had access to manipulate the information? And why? Even more, what was in that folder that caused such a reaction? The technical team assisting us managed to recover some fragments of the deleted video, blurry and fragmented images, as if someone had bet that nothing could be reconstructed. However, a few images revealed something chilling. Esteban could be seen receiving someone, a silhouette that moved quickly, with the face covered or turned away from the camera, but it was clear the intention was to hold a clandestine meeting. The tension was palpable. It seemed like an exchange of information, an urgent dialogue full of warnings. Afterwards, the camera caught something I will never forget. That figure touched something on Esteban's desk with a black glove, and then left without looking back. That made us consider the possibility that what caused his death was not only the direct action of someone, but something much more subtle, a mix of manipulation, pressure, and perhaps even psychological terrorism. What if that strange substance on his hands was part of a device or an experiment that went wrong? The idea of a murder disguised as an accident began to take an unshakable shape. In parallel, I devoted myself to reviewing Esteban's digital correspondence with the help of forensic IT experts. Pandora's box opened slowly. We found encrypted emails with multiple recipients, cryptic message exchanges that at first seemed harmless, but, once decoded, showed clear references to industrial espionage activities, veil threats, and mentioned the Argos project as the core of the conflict. Something related to innovation in artificial intelligence and the development of software capable of altering decisive processes in high-risk financial and governmental sectors. The deeper I delved, the clearer it became that Esteban had fallen into a complex web of interests and dangers. He was not just any man, nor was his death a simple medical matter. Something around him had put him in the crosshairs, and the precision with which they had tried to erase his story from time was almost admirable in its coldness. I especially remember a conversation I had with one of his colleagues, a young programmer who spoke to me with a broken voice and nervous gaze. He told me that Esteban had shown some people a prototype of the project and had insisted on the importance of keeping it secret because, he said, if it falls into the wrong hands, this could destabilize entire systems. To me, it sounded like the script of a movie, but for them it was a harsh reality to live in a world where technology is also an invisible weapon. Days went by, and the investigation led us to analyze in more detail that strange substance found on his hands. The laboratory concluded that it was not only dust used in high-tech components, but was mixed with traces of a neurotoxic compound that, in low concentration, could cause symptoms of confusion, disorientation, and anxiety, very similar to those his acquaintances had observed in Esteban. This confirmed my suspicions. He did not die from a simple accident, but was probably a victim of gradual poisoning, a strategy to weaken him mentally before the fatal outcome. The idea that someone used subtle, slow methods to cause harm made me feel a mix of helplessness and greater determination. Esteban had been attacked both physically and mentally, and the most disturbing thing was that this had gone unnoticed by almost everyone. One night, while reviewing the data and notes, a coincidence caught my attention. The moment when the neurotoxic dust could have been left on his hands corresponded almost exactly with the time the clock stopped. 2014. Like a spiral closing over itself. That hour seemed to be at the heart of the entire enigma. Perhaps that moment not only marked physical death, but the point where Esteban's life began sliding irreversibly toward the abyss. The stop clock was not a coincidence, but a symbolic testimony of that moment. Almost obsessively, I went back to the scene looking for something I might have overlooked until I noticed under the table a small electronic device, camouflaged with tiny wires that seemed connected to the office's electrical system. I carefully picked it up, and at that moment I realized that more than a simple gadget, it was a surveillance device or even a remote manipulation tool. By connecting it and requesting an analysis from the experts, it turned out to be a tool designed to interfere with electromagnetic signals and modify the operating system of any nearby equipment. This could explain the strange manipulation of the cameras and the impossibility of recording or preserving certain crucial hours. I began to feel that this case was turning into a macabre chess game, where every move was calculated to disorient, erase clues, and protect interests much larger than anything someone like Esteban could handle alone. He had tried, perhaps without fully knowing the consequences, to open a door someone powerful wanted closed at all costs. Receiving all of this made me rethink the ethics of my work and the responsibility I carried. It was not just about finding the physical causes of a death. It was about helping give a voice to those who, although silenced, had left enough signals for someone to hear. And I felt that, despite how dark the past seemed, there was a hidden message in all of this. not to let details, no matter how small or insignificant they seem, go unnoticed, because in them lies the truth. The next step was to coordinate a meeting with prosecutors and experts from various fields. We had to proceed cautiously, but with the intention of dismantling that web of concealment. By doing so, we began to unravel this tangle of covert corruption, technological sabotage, and disguised murders. But not everything had been said. That very night, before temporarily closing the case, I received an anonymous call that chilled my blood. A distorted voice informed me that what we had discovered was only the tip of the iceberg, that the Argos project involved much greater risks, and that my life could also be in danger if I kept digging. That warning made me understand that the stop clock was not only a clue in a police case, but a symbol of an invisible border between truth and lies, between justice and power. Esteban Contreras, with his last drop of courage, had left those marks in time for someone to follow, so that his death would not be in vain. At that moment, I knew that this investigation, my work as a forensic expert, would not end with a report or a ruling. It was the beginning of a journey where patience and attention to detail would be my only weapons against an unexpected enemy. The lesson was clear and, at the same time, unsettling. Behind every stopped hour, every frozen clock, there's a story waiting to be heard. It only takes someone willing to stop time for one more moment, to search in the darkness for what others prefer to hide. And I was determined to do so. That anonymous call kept echoing in my mind long after the phone stopped vibrating in my hands. I knew it wasn't a game nor an unfounded threat. It was a profound warning to measure every step, to not be carried away by pressure or the urge to uncover everything all at once. But, on the other hand, I felt a kind of unbreakable duty, an almost moral obligation to keep going because Esteban, with his watch frozen at 8:14 p.m., had left not only a life interrupted but a cry for help disguised in tiny details that few could have heard. The following week was a blink between silence and tension. Every morning I arrived at the lab with a feeling that the ground could give way beneath my feet at any moment, that someone was watching me just as we watched Esteban. We had requested more exhaustive analyses of the electronic device, and while specialists dismantled it piece by piece, they also explored its origin, although in this kind of high-tech equipment. Almost everything was designed to erase traces and trigger false suspicions. It's not a commercial product. That much is certain, one of them told me with a somber tone. This type of technology is only found in the hands of organizations with a very lot of money and resources. My mind began to link every piece with the same thread we have been following for weeks. Industrial espionage, veiled threats, software capable of reshaping systems in critical sectors, and, even darker, Esteban's death disguised under the veil of an accident. Everything pointed to someone not only wanting to silence him, but also erase any trace of his work, his will, his last truth. And that made me remember a phrase a detective said during the initial investigations. Here, they didn't just kill a man, they killed an idea. That disturbing idea haunted me as I reviewed the decrypted emails for the umpteenth time, and found a line that seemed increasingly unsettling. It was from Esteban and said something like, "If something happens to me, trust only the watch. It will tell the truth my words could not." At that moment, I looked again at that stopped watch, that still sign on an ordinary wall, which actually seemed a symbol of resistance and indirect truth. I understood it then as a final message. Esteban had left intentional clues, perhaps without his pursuers knowing, a latent echo that only a patient and sharp gaze like mine could catch. I then decided that the way forward was to try to use the watch and its stop time as a baseline to reconstruct the events before 8:14 p.m. If someone had deleted the audiovisual material from the cameras, perhaps with digital tools and forensic reconstruction techniques, we could resurrect what had been lost. It was a complex task, almost an obsession. I myself spent many hours reviewing fragments, slowing pixelated images, adjusting light and contrast, searching for any reflection, any shadow that could give me a clue, a minimal yet firm hint. Patience was key, and the recent warning reminded me that haste could be fatal. Among the fragmented minutes we managed to recover, we found something surprising. A moment where Esteban seemed to interact with a device that glowed faintly, almost imperceptible at first glance. It was not the folder. It was something else, a kind of small portable terminal, different from any common tool in his office. In those seconds, the camera captured him sliding a finger over the screen before looking toward the entrance with an expression mixed with fear and determination. Then, the figure we had already described appeared again, approaching cautiously, movements almost feline. What happened next was not fully shown. A brief flash, a verbal exchange we couldn't hear, but in Esteban's expression seemed like a command, a final warning. It was at that point I realized that encounter, that brief moment before 8:14 p.m., was a real deployment of hidden forces I had been trying to understand. It wasn't just a clandestine meeting, but the awakening of a deeper conflict, a fierce dispute to control not only information, but the very power contained in Project Argos. There was a very concrete shadow, an actor moving behind all we had witnessed, and who didn't want anyone to come out unscathed. It was then that new data related to LT came into my hands, the mysterious initials Esteban had mentioned in his notebook. Finally, after requesting collaboration from intelligence and surveillance experts, we obtained a cold and hard profile. LT was not a common person nor just an acronym. It was linked to a high executive of a multinational technology company with interests in the governmental and financial sector, one of the darkest and least accessible groups to justice. That person had been involved in several digital control projects in Latin America, projects that sought not only protect infrastructures, but also to intervene in and manipulate strategic decisions. The name was a key, a door to a network we were only beginning to understand. With every advance, I felt a curtain lifting that involved not only the reality of Esteban's death, but the vulnerability of an entire system, a framework that looked much more like a lethal web than a simple industrial conspiracy. Project Argos, with its capacity to influence decisive processes through smart software, turned out to be something much larger and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. And, most distressingly, no one seemed completely safe from its ramifications. One of those long nights, while reviewing the crime scene again with 3D reconstruction specialists, something buzzed inside me like a silent alarm. By crossing data from different moments, we found that environmental conditions, the temperature, humidity, even the light intensity in the office, had been deliberately altered. A small device hidden in the air conditioning system manipulated these variables, generating effects not only physical but psychological. It was constant pressure, a subliminal form of harassment that could very well have contributed to deteriorating Esteban's mental health in his last days. This made me think about the harsh reality barely told in forensic work. Not all violent deaths result from visible blows or wounds, but often are built slowly with invisible tools because they reside in the mind and the conditions surrounding a person's life. Revealing that truth was as important as analyzing toxicology samples or recovering recordings. Then, one afternoon when I already felt accumulated fatigue, I received an email with no sender and an attachment. At first, I thought I should ignore it. It was a possible trap or another threat. But the nature of the message was different. It was a video letter from someone who seemed to know the truth but was afraid. The voice was shaky, speaking of corruption inside government offices, of infiltration by private interests, and of the cruel consequence of trying to compete against forces that don't play fair. They warned that Esteban was not a reckless hero, but an unwitting martyr in an invisible war of power and control. That someone asked us to continue the search, to give voice to what Esteban could not finish writing. That video became a turning point. It led us to new hypotheses, to consider that perhaps the meaning of the stopwatch had gone beyond time and physics. It was a symbolic phenomenon, almost an act of resistance itself, a sign that although they wanted to stop him, they couldn't stop the truth he was managing to unveil. Amid all this, the weight of my responsibility became increasingly tangible. I couldn't satisfy those who wanted to bury the case in dead files, nor allow Esteban's effort to become a lost whisper. Every detail found, every small clue, brought us a little closer to dismantling that system, but also painted a more visible target on my routine and my steps. That's why I felt a chill when, one night, while reviewing some footnotes, I noticed a shadow on the other side of my house window. I wasn't alone. It was a confirmation I both expected and feared. The threads of that dark network had begun weaving around me as well. I knew it would be a battle much bigger than physical time. It would be a struggle to uncover what lies hidden beneath the controlled, concealed surface. That, after all, The watch hadn't just stopped Esteban's seconds, but had marked the beginning of a path in which I, like him, had to learn to listen to the imperceptible, to hold the truth amid the fog, and not give up. Meanwhile, I'm still here, trying to make sense of that 8:14 p.m., trying so that that moment suspended in time doesn't remain condemned to oblivion, because I know that behind that little stopwatch beats a vital truth, a story that must not die in silence or with fading tick-tocks. And that is the story I continue to tell now, so that none of those forgotten seconds are in vain. I never imagined that simple clock stopped at 8:14 p.m. will become the epicenter of such a deep and sinister network, nor that through it I would shed light on a web of secrets and silences that cost so many lives to maintain. But the deeper I delved into the case, the clearer it became that this was not an ordinary story of accidental death or just an accident. It was a labyrinth of power and manipulation, where Esteban, unknowingly, had become trapped as a fundamental and expendable piece, and I, by my own choice, began to become his involuntary successor. That early morning, sitting in the darkness of the laboratory, I looked at the clock again. We had subjected it to such a detailed analysis that I could almost feel its weight and texture in my hands just by closing my eyes. It was an object that defied the ordinary, that seemed to carry in its small mechanism a kind of meticulous clandestinity. I remember the advice given by one of the electronic experts. When a device is designed to erase its traces, it's because something or someone wants you not to exist. That thought made me shudder. It wasn't just a stop clock. It was a message encrypted in silence. I then decided to analyze the chair where Esteban had been sitting in those last fateful minutes. We hadn't paid much attention at first, but something about the office layout, the exact position of the chair, and the watch strap called me to reconsider. With the help of 3D reconstruction technicians, we took precise measurements and reconstructed the scene again. It became clear that Esteban was in a state of tension, that his movements before the fateful hour were not those of someone about to close their workday without problems, but rather those of someone hopeful and, at the same time, worried. That's how we discovered the first unexpected twist. In Esteban's computer's increased orbit, among the data erased through recovery software, an encrypted hidden file with several layers of protection appeared. It was no ordinary file. Its name was simple but as forceful as a clock. Final underscore evidence. That file could contain the key to the great mystery, but it also represented a huge risk for those who hoped the case would close quietly. We installed a special station with advanced decryption software, and slowly, we made our way into the unknown. Every line we managed to extract was a window into Esteban's brave and clandestine work on Project Argos, an investigation far beyond what was authorized or conventional. It was a hidden voice, from someone who had realized that behind the technological solution to protect the country were dark interests, using the project to control, not protect, and who killed mercilessly to maintain power. As we investigated, the tension grew. We felt watched, our movements monitored with an almost obsessive zeal. The anonymous call, the shadow by the window, those cryptic messages appearing in signed emails confirmed that we were in dangerous territory. It became clear that whoever pulled the strings had the resources and the will to destroy anyone trying to uncover the truth. But instead of intimidating us, that made us more determined. Amid that dynamic, a new piece appeared. An old friend of Esteban's, also involved in Project Argos, agreed to a private meeting with me. She was an intellectual woman, tenacious and fearful, but eager for justice. She gave me a notebook with Esteban's notes, scribbles that seemed disconnected but now resonated with meaning, codes, symbols, dates, and names. Among them, repeated reference to LT and a so-called internal command. From there, we started linking the pieces. LT was not only a corporate figure, he was a shadow leader directing this macabre game. His initiatives ranged from information management to installing devices to manipulate the environment, exerting both physical and psychological control. The small device in the air conditioner that altered temperature and humidity was no coincidence, but a mechanism designed to break Esteban's resistance, to make him vulnerable, invisible. I learned that the most dangerous enemy was the one who could manipulate our senses, make us doubt our own mind, wear us down little by little, without leaving visible marks. This revelation made me review Esteban's psychological autopsy and medical background carefully. There were subtle signs of chronic stress, growing paranoia, and staged anonymous aggressions. Conclusive evidence that his environment had become an unrelenting trap. However, the resistance Esteban had built was what we now tried to preserve. Hence the meaning of the clock, a stop counter as a symbol that despite the imposed silence, the time of truth had not stopped. The clock was a message, a hidden key for those who knew how to look, a kind of vigil concentrated at that precise moment that could not go unnoticed. That act, which someone else might have considered insignificant, was actually Esteban's last cry. When we managed to open the final undiscovered evidence file, I understood that everything had been so cleverly prepared that it not only contained information, but a kind of digital testament. There was evidence of clandestine meetings, audio-recorded testimonies, intercepted messages, and above all, a documented record of the threats and sabotage Esteban faced. The files detailed the covert sabotage operation against Project Argos and the silent collusion of organizations with interests opposed to transparency and justice. What we uncovered was not just an industrial network, but a shadow political scenario that endangered the very stability of national systems, a shadow extending far beyond Chile. Each document could be a time bomb, capable of shaking power structures on a continental level. At that moment, the pressure increased. I found direct messages on my phone, veiled warnings through unanswered calls, and subtle surveillance that kept me on edge. I knew I had to act cautiously, but also quickly. It was not just a matter of discovering the truth, but protecting the truth, keeping it alive. I then decided to do what Esteban had planned. Using the technology and information collected, I discreetly coordinated with trusted allies in the prosecutor's office and international organizations to ensure that the evidence and investigations would not be lost. That process was slow, tense, and full of risks, but fundamental so that what began with a stop clock turned into a silent movement capable of bringing a hidden reality to light. But the story does not end here. As the network is exposed and justice begins to move, the dark shadow starts to recede, at least publicly. However, the threat remains, floating in the air like the same endless tick-tock of that clock we see stopped, but that, in reality, never stopped counting. Because deep down I know the greatest battle is in memory, in keeping history alive and not let it become a dead echo. Sometimes I wonder what Esteban would have thought knowing his clock would become the symbol of this fight. It's a thought that doesn't leave me in the long nights when silence weighs heavier than any noise. He died trying to embrace the truth, and now it's up to us to hold that flame, no matter how deep the darkness around it. Because in these cases, one learns that time does not just count seconds, but stories, struggles, and memories that survive even after the last heartbeat. That's why I'm still here, on this path that started with an apparently insignificant detail, a frozen clock that didn't match the official narrative. In that incongruity hid a vital truth, a truth we could not allow to die with Esteban, nor be lost in the silence imposed by fear or indifference. There is still much to do, many pieces to discover and paths to take. I know this story will not have a definitive end in my hands, but understanding that every little detail, every moment suspended in time, can make a difference keeps me standing. Because in the end, as a forensic expert, as a narrator of silences, my commitment is to what others do not want to hear, to what remains beyond death and oblivion. And that is what I will keep doing, as long as that clock, stopped for the world, continues to mark for me the unbreakable pulse of truth. As we moved forward, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Every discovery opened a new door, but behind that door waited a tangle more complex and darker than the last. It was exhausting, yes, but impossible to stop now. The very fact that we had gotten this far, deciphered that file called Evidentia Discrefinal, and breathed in Esteban's final words to his notes and recorded voices was irrefutable proof that we were on the right path. Only that path seemed to trap us in an endless whirlpool. I remember one particularly difficult night. I was reviewing some recordings in which Esteban narrated in a low voice, almost to himself, episodes of constant surveillance, subtle attacks against his professional and personal integrity, leading up to direct threats that seemed to have precipitated his final fate. Listening to those words, in the heavy stillness of the lab, felt like encountering a wounded spirit, abandoned to its fate. "I can't trust anyone," he said with broken voice, "because the network is bigger than I imagined." And that led us to question everything, even our own safety. It was at that moment we decided this case had come out of the shadows where it had been kept too long. I contacted a trusted journalist, someone who understood the gravity and scope without falling into cheap sensationalism. Their help was crucial to filter the story and open a public window without putting those of us still inside at risk. But like lighting a bonfire in the middle of the night, we soon realized the light attracted many eyes, including the darkest ones. The phone started ringing persistently. Not only calls of support or from anonymous allies, but also the usual silences on the other end, bursts of static, encrypted messages demanding caution or warning of imminent consequences. The paranoia that had consumed Esteban began filtering among us. However, each threat was also a drive. I couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. That was when I came across a new element no one had foreseen. A second clock, apparently normal, found in a drawer alongside Esteban's other personal belongings. This clock worked, but had a strange peculiarity. It showed the time of the constant offset a few seconds ahead, as if trying to anticipate real time, as it played with perception and reality. At first glance, it seemed a minor, even strange detail, but when we synchronized it with the notes Esteban had left in his notebook, it took on a disturbing meaning. Those marks, those numbers written hurriedly and with some despair, seemed to indicate a countdown. LT not only directed the operation from the shadows, but had their own clocks, their own timings, their own methods to measure who and when should fall. The offset on that clock made us think it wasn't just about marking a moment, but controlling that very moment, playing an invisible chess game between lives and secrets. That revelation led us to re-examine with clinical precision every movement recorded in the office video footage, every entrance and exit of the building, every call or email Esteban had received days before his death. We discovered patterns, repetitive schedules, moments of intentional gaps in the records that could only be explained by the meticulous action of someone who knew the system's workings to the smallest detail. And right there in those gaps, we identified what seemed to be covert interventions, illegal accesses and manipulation of digital evidence. The certainty that we were facing a machine designed to operate without leaving a trace was, at once, terrifying and motivating. After many sleepless nights, I understood that the force we faced was not just a group of corporate or political interests, but an organic network that adapted, mutated, and erased all traces with surgical precision. Esteban had been fighting a monster many preferred to ignore, and now that monster stalked us too. Amid all this darkness, Esteban's figure became almost heroic, a mixture of scientist, guardian, and silent martyr. Every piece of data, every recovered file, and every testimony we managed to gather seemed to expand that portrait, painted with the shadow of constant threat. His last days were marked not only by fear, but also by an unwavering will leave a legacy, a truth no one could suppress. But as our network of allies grew, so did the danger. I received a call I will never forget. The voice, unknown, cold, and distant, warned me to stop, that this battle had no room for the curious or idealists, that continuing meant crossing a line of no return. That warning, instead of paralyzing me, fueled my determination. What they wanted was fear, for us to fall into resignation or vanish under a cloak of silence. But we were closer than ever to something that could change everything. In those days, a strange pulse accompanied my thoughts. The silent tick-tock of that stopped clock which, ironically, seemed to beat stronger the more we delved into the enigma. That duality between stop time and running time was the very essence of the case. Esteban's death had not been an end point, but a turning point. His stop clock had become the warning signal for those of us who refused to let the commitment to truth die with him. Slowly, the echoes of Project Argos began to resonate in broader circles, generating debate, questioning, even bewilderment. It was inevitable that the secrets hidden under layers of lies would start to reveal the fragility of a system that, in theory, should protect us all. Yet behind that system, shadows operated capable of silencing anyone daring to challenge their decrees. It was in the midst of this whirlwind that I understood Esteban's tragedy was not only his own, but ours as well. An open wound in the conscience of a country that must rise, look inward, and accept that these battles, the truly decisive ones, are fought beyond headlines, in the invisible cracks of everyday reality. The case, then, began to transcend its own nature. It was no longer just a forensic act or a police puzzle, but an urgent call to responsibility, to memory, to justice that is slow but must come. With every new piece discovered, I understood our work could not be limited to recording death, but to giving it voice, to being that bridge that official accounts have traditionally forgotten. In that effort, unexpected episodes arose. Testimonies appearing out of nowhere, documents we thought lost emerging from forgotten archives, even almost theatrical acts, where the enemy's very paranoia became our ally, leaving perhaps intentional clues to unleash a chain of effects we never imagined possible. But we also faced losses. Close people, informants who inexplicably hid or disappeared, leaving an unsettling trail of uncertainty. Those silences, those absences were cruel reminders of how real the danger was. I never stopped wondering how many other Estebans had succumbed in the dark without the chance to tell their stories. Still, the effort never slackened. If anything became clear, it's that the stop clock did not signal an end. It was a trigger, an unmistakable warning that truth exists beyond clocks, beyond imposed silence, and perhaps even beyond fear. Now, as I write these words and hear the distant tick-tock of my own clock, I know the journey is just beginning. This case, which no one expected to transcend, has made me a living part of that story Esteban wanted to tell. And though truth sometimes seems like a maze with no exit, it is also the flame that forces us to keep going. Because if I learned anything from this experience, both professionally and personally, it is that death can freeze time for a body but never for truth. And when that truth seizes heart and mind, it becomes unstoppable, latent, eternal. So, friend, if you ever doubt the importance of small detail, remember this story. A stop clock, some handwritten notes, a file hidden deep inside a computer. That was all it took to change a story. To open a door and challenge the shadows. To remind us that, in the end, silences also speak. You just have to know how to listen as we delve deeper into every detail. The feeling of being watched did not diminish. On the contrary, it seemed to intensify with every move we made. The curious thing was that, no matter how many precautions we took, interference in our communications and small anomalies in the systems kept appearing. We had gone from being mere investigators to pieces on a dangerous board where the rules were unclear and the enemy invisible. The constant tension began to wear us down, but it also kept us alert, as if our very survival depended on it. One night, while reviewing security camera footage from the building where Esteban worked, I noticed something that had escaped me in previous attempts. In a moment when we all believed there was no record, a seemingly innocuous gap, a dark, almost ghostly figure appeared, moving quickly down the hallway. The video was blurry. It was difficult to establish identity or intent, but its mere presence was alarming. What surprised me even more was that, alongside that apparition, the clock found in Esteban's drawer showed its particular discrepancy. For a few seconds, the time on screen and the real time seemed not to match. It was that moment that made me understand the depth of the game we were being subjected to. It wasn't just about manipulating data or silencing voices, but also altering our most basic perception. Time is a reliable measure in memory as an anchor of truth. The fast-running clock marked not only a technological discrepancy, but an existential gap, a warning that what we thought we knew was not enough to understand what was really happening. Esteban had left a cryptic clue. That discrepancy was his way of telling us that the moment of truth was near, and we had to be prepared for an unexpected outcome. In the following weeks, we adjusted our strategy, trying to anticipate the moves of those operating in the shadows. We discovered that the enemy not only knew how to hide, but also how to sow confusion and mistrust among us. There were alliances that broke, voices silenced, and messages that changed tone with veiled threats. It was clear that someone was watching our actions and wanted to stop us, and that someone had access to channels and resources that, at first glance, seemed unreachable. Despite the fear, there were moments of clarity and courage. I remember one early morning when, after long hours of analysis, we found particular correspondence between the attacks Esteban suffered and certain high-level financial documents. That connection, unexpected but emphatic, opened a window into the true motivations behind the entire operation. It was not just about control or political power. There were dark economic interests, Transactions in which a person's life and safety were disposable pawns in a faceless game. That revelation hit hard because it faced us with a corrupt system whose length was difficult to measure. The internal pressure began to manifest not only within the team, but also within me. Sometimes I wondered if we had crossed an invisible line separating professional investigation from personal risk. Every out-of-place noise, every shadow at the doorway became a latent threat. However, behind that fragility was also the certainty that surrender was not an option. Esteban's memory and his struggle gave us an almost unbreakable strength. One of the most unsettling episodes occurred when, already with the story partially disclosed to the journalist, we received an anonymous package without a sender that contained an unexpected item, a small electronic device with encoded recordings. We didn't know what to expect, but analyzing its contents, we understood it was a kind of secret diary in which someone close to Esteban had secretly documented the threats and manipulations suffered. The voice was recognizable, fragmented by emotion but also fear, which gave each spoken word an almost heartbreaking nuance. That revelation made us rethink who were allies and who might be enemies. The recorded testimonies pointed to figures who appeared to have clean, official roles but who in the shadows facilitated the machinery Esteban had tried to expose. The most worrying thing was that the network we discovered was far broader than we had imagined, with deep tentacles in several institutions, even those responsible for protecting us. The feeling of being trapped in a labyrinth without an exit began to settle in, but they will remain intact because every new piece of information was a light in the darkness. Meanwhile, the seemingly harmless clock remained there, with its fragmented movement, marking a time that no one else seemed to understand. I became obsessed with it, as if its irregular ticking were the heartbeat of a hidden truth. Every time I held it in my hand, I felt a mixture of unease and hope. It was a tangible symbol of all the effort we had made and the challenge still ahead. It seemed to whisper that the great revelation was near, but that the path to reach it would be arduous and dangerous. One of the most unexpected twists occurred when a former official, who decided to break his silence, gave us crucial information about Project Argos. Thanks to him, we understood that we were not just dealing with a criminal case of manipulation or murder, but with a much more complex web involving mass surveillance, institutional corruption, and a silent system of social control. That testimony was a turning point. We began to glimpse the true dimension of the monster Esteban had faced, and that we now had confront. This knowledge came with a growing sense of urgency. It was not enough to expose the truth slowly or partially. Processes had to be accelerated, and those we could still save protected. In this context, I understood that the stopped clock, that seemingly insignificant piece, was actually a perfect metaphor. The slowing down and attempt to halt the story, which had to be corrected and told. Time, although marked at irregular intervals by that device, was the ally that pushed us forward, not allowing silence to prevail. With the journalist collaboration, we launched a campaign to gather testimonies, evidence, and names, seeking a support network that extended beyond our limited forces. The response began to be overwhelming. Messages from people who, in their anonymity, wished the truth to come to light. Veiled threats, yes, but also a growing social movement that could not be ignored. It was a slow process, full of stumbles, but the repercussions quickly crossed the boundaries of our circle, bringing to the table questions that until then had seemed unthinkable. However, not everything was progress. The shadow grew heavier, with direct intimidation acts against our environment, cars in front of the house, emails with damaging links, even blatant sabotage attempts at our workplace. Tension became a constant presence, a tangible reminder that this journey was dangerous, and that every step forward came with a real risk. But it was also the definitive proof of the case's relevance, because when the truth makes people uncomfortable, darkness reacts violently. In that climate of uncertainty and distrust, something very human accompanied me. Empathy for Esteban and for those who, like him, become trapped in these invisible nets. Thus, every advance, every revelation carried an intense emotional weight, a mixture of sadness for the loss and pride for the struggle kept alive through us. I understood that beyond forensic science, beyond the technical search for evidence, this was a battle of values, of fundamental principles that defined our place in society. As the investigation progressed, I was forced to reflect deeply on the concept of time, memory, and justice. That fast-running clock, which at first glance might seem a whim or oddity, represented for us an eternal paradox. Time, it seemed, stopped, the fact that death freezes a moment, but that truth always continues its slow and relentless march until someone uncovers it. Esteban had left his legacy not only in documents or recordings, but in that tangible metaphor that was a clock, a reminder that even in the absolute silence, there is a ticking that cannot be silenced. And in those moments of introspection, I understood that the story we had pulled from the shadows no longer belonged only to us. It had become a collective call, a demand for a country, a humanity that often forgets that truth is not a luxury but a necessity. That clocks do not only mark the hour, but encode crucial moments when justice dares to emerge. So, while I want to believe we were closer to the end of this dark chapter, the case remained an enigma defying any conventional logic. The web expanded, the actors multiplied, and yet every detail, however small, indicated that the clock, with its silent, irregular ticking, was the compass toward that truth no one could stop. I clearly remember that last night I was in the lab, looking at the stop clock beside my table. It was as if it spoke to me in a language I was just beginning to understand, reminding me that beyond death, beyond fear and shadows, justice was a process that does not give up, that there were still doors open, voices to hear, and silences to break. At that moment, I knew the story had not ended with Esteban, but was only just beginning to be written. And that certainty, my friend, is what I share with you now. Because in my experience, death may stop time for a body, but truth, with all its broken or fast-running clocks, keeps an eternal ticking. A heartbeat that, if someone dares to listen, wants to tell a story that must never be forgotten. Days passed that felt like endless nights as we analyzed every fragment of information with a firm conviction that the clock, stopped yet devoid of stillness, held a message locked within its irregular ticking. It was as if Esteban had manipulated time from beyond death, a kind of cryptic warning for those of us daring to investigate his disappearance. We had to understand what that discrepancy meant, that solitary and erratic tick-tock that seemed to want to break the silence imposed by the darkness. Was it perhaps a symbol, a code, a deliberate mechanism that Esteban left for us? Or simply another mistake in a case full of unsettling coincidences? During long and silent nights, when exhaustion threatened to overcome me, I found myself holding that clock in my hands, try to find meaning in its mechanism, sometimes stopped, sometimes hurried. It was a crossroads between obsession and hope, because that small object seemed to hold the key to deciphering the labyrinth we were immersed in. I knew, with a deep and almost painful certainty, that it was not a random component. Somehow, Esteban had used that clock to reveal the truth to those of us left behind, to guide us amidst chaos and uncertainty. Meanwhile, the threats intensified, and the shadows stalking us became more palpable. It was not just intimidating messages or clandestine incursions. One day, returning home after a long shift in the lab, I noticed someone had tampered with my front door, attempting to enter in my absence. It was a brutal reminder that we were venturing into dangerous territory, and any one of us could be the next sacrifice piece in this merciless game. But despite the fear, determination grew stronger with time. We would be forced to confront what Esteban had wanted to expose, to unveil the best-kept secrets of a manipulative and corrupt system. On one of those fateful nights, I received an anonymous message containing an address and a time for a clandestine meeting. That risky and suspicious encounter promised the emergence of a new link in the chain of evidence we were seeking. I accepted the invitation, accompanied only by a small trusted team, expecting to find answers but aware of the latent risk. Upon arrival at the place, an old warehouse on the outskirts of Santiago, the atmosphere was as oppressive as the shadows covering its interior. A figure in shadows greeted us, whose identity I still do not know, but whose trembling voice revealed the weight of years of fear and repression. In their hands was an old notebook filled with notes, diagrams, and names directly linking officials with seemingly clean positions, but who in reality wove part of the dark network Esteban had tried to uncover. That notebook revealed a systematic operation to silence uncomfortable voices, a structure combining technological surveillance, political pressure, and covert violence. But the most shocking discovery was documents certifying the use of advanced real-time manipulation technologies in recordings and communications, a sophisticated method to generate disinformation and create perception gaps in the public and official investigations. The stop clock, which apparently marked death, was in fact a symbol of that temporal manipulation. Esteban had suffered not only the physical attack, but an intrusion into reality itself, an attempt to make his truth disappear by altering time markers, memories, and evidence. As we unraveled each layer of that scheme, I felt the tension consuming me more and more. I couldn't trust anyone, and paranoia crept into my thoughts like a whirlwind. It was like playing on the edge of madness, trying to discern between reality and illusions woven by those wanting to control the narrative. However, that mental toll brought with it a strange clarity. I understood we were facing an enemy who not only used brute force, but mastered psychological manipulation, the dark art of fragmenting perception so that the truth would dissolve into confusion. One day, upon reviewing Esteban's forensic report again, I detected an anomaly that had gone unnoticed. The autopsy indicated an approximate time of death different from the initial one, and the discrepancy matched the period when his clock marked an advanced time. This confirmed that someone had altered the evidence to fit the official version, but the most disturbing part was understanding who and how they had managed to modify not only physical evidence, but the very chronology of the case. The conclusion was terrifying. We were up against a system capable of rewriting a victim's history, even after their death. We then decided to seek help outside official channels. We contacted a group of experts in technology and cryptography, who, after hours of meticulous work, managed to unravel some hidden codes in the electronic files obtained. Amid encrypted messages and camouflage signals appeared direct links to powerful business and political interests, revealing an infamous and well-structured network extending beyond our borders. It was not just a local case or an isolated plot, but part of a transnational scheme with consequences beyond our initial understanding. With each new discovery, the clock seemed to beat more strongly in my consciousness, reminding me not only of the fragility of time, but of its power as the only evidence that cannot be completely falsified. Sometimes I felt Esteban was there with me, showing us that irregular tick-tock as a whisper of urgency, urging us not to lower our guard, not to fall into exhaustion or despair. Amid chaos, that invisible connection became the source of my resistance and that of the team. However, the increasing exposure of the investigation brought inevitable consequences. One of our closest collaborators abruptly disappeared, and although we never managed to find him, his absence dealt a crushing blow to all of us. The reality was clear. Those behind all of this did not hesitate to use fear and violence to protect their secrets. It was a brutal reminder that the truth not only discomforts, but threatens the very survival of those who pursue it. The risk, which until then seemed abstract, materialized at every moment. Nevertheless, the pressure only strengthened our commitment. In every meeting, in every analysis, I thought of Esteban and that man who, despite everything, left a coded message in a stop clock. That symbol became our banner, the silent promise that we would not stop until we unraveled the whole case and brought it to society. Because in his interrupted fight lay the hope of justice for all those silenced by a corrupt and lethal system. Amid this storm of secrets and dangers, there was an unexpected moment of hope. One of the officials working at the heart of the scheme approached us secretly, willing to provide additional evidence. In exchange, he asked for protection and the commitment that his identity would not be revealed until he felt safe. This act of bravery gave us access to a series of confidential files proving chronological manipulation in previous investigations and the existence of a state apparatus designed to control and subvert judicial processes. It was, without a doubt, the missing piece to complete a puzzle Esteban had begun to build with effort and risk. This contribution renewed our energy. We were not alone. There were allies willing to break the silence, risking everything for the truth to emerge. However, we also knew that each step we took brought us closer to danger. We were no longer just investigators. We were witnesses to a dark and widespread reality, guardians of an uncomfortable truth many would rather bury forever. Despite everything, the clock remained there, and in each irregular tick-tock was a promise that truth does not stop, even if it seems asleep, deceived, or manipulated. Its disorderly march was a perfect representation of our journey, that slow and constant struggle against shadows that wanted to impose silence. And within us, the will to honor that struggle, to listen to that heartbeat that never ceases, because as long as there's a tick-tock, Hope is alive and justice is not a chimera, but an urgent necessity. Thus continues the story, my friend. A living tale marked by uncertainty and courage, where every broken clock is a call not to forget, where every temporal gap is a sign not to give in. Because, in the end, true justice is not a stop moment, but that eternal heartbeat that drives us to seek, to question, and not to let darkness have the last word. And in that gesture, in that will define time, lies Esteban's legacy and the path we must now follow. That night, when I returned to the warehouse with a notebook and the confidential files, I felt how reality became infused with density that I could not unravel with simple words. Each page, each document revealed a complexity that struck directly at the heart of what we believed was just and transparent. As I delved into the names, dates, and schemes, I understood that what Esteban had begun to unravel was a Gordian knot of temporal traps and silent maneuvers, a conspiracy that challenged not only common logic, but the very way we understand time and truth. There was evidence, for example, of how certain digital recordings were intentionally delayed or advanced to destabilize testimonies, generating confusion that the perpetrators exploited to erase traces, sow doubt, or directly fabricate tailored official versions. The stop clock I had found at the scene was not just a simple piece out of place, but tangible evidence of that twisted strategy, a cryptic symbol that marked a real-time altar by hand seeking to hide reality, that forced us to scrutinize everything we had taken for granted until then. But the deeper I immersed myself in those files, the more I felt a growing pressure that did not come from outside, but from within those of us on the team. Something was beginning to upset the group dynamic, as if the shadow of paranoia was seeping into every glance and every silence. The threat that once seemed external now also manifested itself in the emotional wear and mistrust emerging among colleagues, among people who until then shared a common goal. It was not just the fear of an invisible enemy, but the fear of not knowing whom you could truly trust with the most delicate information. Answer after answer, new evidence after new evidence, I started to notice small cracks in the relationships with some teammates. Two of them, without apparent reason, showed evasive attitudes, delays, excuses for missing certain meetings, cryptic messages on their phones that had more than they revealed. It was then that I decided to act cautiously and avoid sharing certain data with them, at least until I understood what motivated those behaviors. In a job where the risk of infiltration was very high, any misstep could be fatal. I felt a weight on my back, not only because of the magnitude of the investigation, but because of the growing feeling of being trapped in a web where even the presence of those around could be part of the risk. That night, as I reviewed in my mind everything discovered, I received an email with no sender and an attached link to a video. That file turned out to be a secret recording of a clandestine meeting held in a high-level government office. In the recording, several figures discuss a strategy to manipulate evidence like Esteban's and keep the official narrative intact. The voices were low but clear. They spoke cynically about how to adjust timing in medical reports, how to alter the hour and minute stamps on digital evidence, and how to discredit those who try to question the system. It was a raw confession, nothing veiled, a spoken text that made it clear that the mechanism of temporal control was a tool of power to erase not only the victim, but their very truth. That revelation shook me to the core. To what extent were we fighting shadows? How many other cases, besides Esteban's, had been shaped by that same machinery? The dehumanization of the system was terrifying, yet we had to carry on. It was not just a professional matter, but an act of justice, and of survival of the commitment to the truth. In those days, the team redoubled vigilance. We decided to separate work areas, divide critical information, and establish encrypted communications that minimized the risk of leaks. Every step we took was an exercise in balance, to avoid exposing ourselves too much or becoming paralyzed by fear. Meetings became more sporadic, tense, and silent, and each member carried an invisible burden understood only by exchanging tired looks, knowing, without words, what was at stake. One early morning, while reviewing the digital security protocols we used, I received a call from a colleague on the tech experts team. His voice was urgent but restrained, as if speaking in a secret language to avoid raising suspicion. He informed me that strange movements had been detected on our accounts, attempts to access from unknown locations, and patterns that clearly showed someone was watching us. That moment was one of the most terrifying I have experienced in this investigation. because it was no longer just a conceptual or theoretical issue, but a tangible, urgent, and palpable danger that could break the delicate fabric of trust and life we maintained. I remembered how, not long ago, someone had tried to force entry into my house, and I realized the threat was not only against me, but against all of us involved in a crucial search for the truth behind the stop clock. That certainty led me to strengthen my protection network, trust only what was essential, and keep my mind open but firm against the emotional impact this entailed. It was in that context that the informant inside the system, the anonymous official seeking protection, played a fundamental role. The new evidence they provided not only confirmed the time manipulations, but also led us to a key name, a high-ranking official within the judiciary, responsible for coordinating and overseeing the alteration of records in sensitive cases. It was clear this person had control to sabotage evidence meticulously, and their influence reached collaborators across various departments, ensuring impunity for the corrupt network. With this information in hand, I decided it was time to make a bold move. We called a selective meeting in a safe place to share the finding and devise a strategy that would allow us not only protect the evidence, but also to take it to the public knowledge without it being blocked by the power trained to divert and erase uncomfortable truths. The tension was palpable. Every word weighed heavily. Every look evaluated the frantic measures we had to take to stay alive and control the narrative. However, the game did not end there. At one of the most unexpected moments, a twist shook us hard. One of the most distrusting collaborators, who until then had maintained an evasive attitude, appeared with a disconcerting confession. He revealed he had been forced to cooperate with the corrupt system under threats against his family, but now he was willing to risk everything to redeem himself and provide key information. His account included details about manipulated recordings, bribes, and links with multinational companies involved in disinformation operations. For a moment, we felt a breath of relief, as if the moon timidly peeked out after a storm. But soon after, we witnessed a scene that showed how dangerous it was to move forward. The figure who had given us that valuable information disappeared overnight, leaving no trace. His absence not only created a void in the team, but sowed terrible doubt. Was he really free, or had he been neutralized, like so many pieces before? The moral blow was devastating. The uncertainty his disappearance brought eclipsed at times, even the thread of hope that kept us standing. Nevertheless, the memory of Esteban and the promise embodied in that stopped clock became the beacon that lit the way after the darkness. As the story became entrenched in an endless tangle, with underground currents of betrayals and sleepless nights, I understood something deep and disturbing. Our enemy not only manipulates time, but also plays with the time perception of those of us who investigate. That fragmentation of reality was felt in every step, in every doubt, in every moment of mental fatigue. But amidst that storm, the chaotic tick-tock of the clock kept marking the rhythm, reminding us that while truth may seem stopped or accelerated at times, it is always present, waiting to be heard. I cannot stop thinking about it when night falls over Santiago and silence becomes absolute. I think of Esteban, his struggle, and that small but powerful artifact he left behind. The broken clock that did not match is not just an object. It is a testimony in itself, a call not to accept things as they're imposed on us, to dig patiently and courageously. Because sooner or later, every tick-tock, however irregular, is a cry of truth piercing the densest silence. Even when we face a system that seems invincible in its ability to shape reality according to the whims of power, I know our mission is to resist, advance, and honor the legacy of those who, like Esteban, paid with their lives trying to restore justice's true pulse. It will not be easy or fast, but as long as there is a tick-tock, an inscription, a gaze that will not submit, truth has the fuel to keep existing. And if you want to learn something from this story I share with you, it is this: never underestimate a stopped clock. Because when it seems everything is stopped, perhaps what is happening is that someone else is trying to make us forget that time and truth walk together, even if sometimes they do so in strange rhythms, to find the visible world. So stay alert, my friend, because this story is not over and the clock keeps marking in its own rhythm the relentless march of justice we're called to defend. Days passed, and the atmosphere around us grew increasingly dense, as if the very air conspired to confuse us, to make us lose our sense of time and reality. The disappearance of our collaborator left us in a state oscillating between fear and determination, and although we tried to contain the uncertainty, the shadow of the unknown remained lurking, like a silent presence in the room. We had become tired watchers, detectives trapped in a labyrinth where every exit seemed to lead to a dead end. Yet, the stop clock remained the only compass on that fractured map. I cannot deny that, at that moment, I felt the line between paranoia and reality begin to blur. I heard noises at night that weren't there, noticed movements in shadows when no one should have been there, and sometimes I found myself mentally reviewing the same documents over and over, as if by doing, so I could find hidden code in the words, a key among the numbers and dates that had been concealed in plain sight. The investigation demanded superhuman patience. Every discovery came with an emotional burden that sometimes felt too great to bear. Still, we could not stop. Even though the walls seemed to close in tighter and tighter, and the weight of what we uncovered was packed into every quickened beat of our own fear. One morning, while reviewing some reports that fell into my hands thanks to a new contact, a person who preferred to avoid cameras and microphones, I found something that would change everything again. It was a set of digital logs with mind-boggling time alteration maps, not only related to Esteban's case, but also to other cases we had never linked before. There were precise records of removed clocks, evidence reprogrammed in laboratories, and even coordinated testimonies over the phone to support the official narrative contrary to the truth. That network was not just an isolated maneuver. It was a meticulously designed plot to consolidate the power of those who benefited from keeping the lie intact and safe. I couldn't help but think about how fragile the truth is when facing those who control the narrative. Our responsibility became a race against time, though paradoxically that time was adulterated, fragmented, and armored by dozens of layers of secrets and forgeries. I mentally traced the chronology while speaking with a small team that still fully trusted our purpose. And I remember the image of the stop clock, a small, almost insignificant object to anyone else, but one that contained within its silence a powerful claim. As if that clock were the only physical evidence shouting amid a world where everything else had become suspicious or manipulated. The clandestine meetings we organized to share findings and plan strategies became exercises in maximum caution, a delicate balance between conveying necessary information and protecting ourselves from invisible eyes that always seemed to be watching. The tension was palpable in the air and clung to the skin, yet upon that tension we built a silent wall of loyalty and commitment. We knew every word, every whisper could be intercepted, and that at the slightest carelessness, the entire structure we had managed to build would collapse like a house of cards. In one of those meetings, an unexpected discovery broke the mold of our certainties again. Miguel, the digital security expert, showed us a new piece of the puzzle. Malicious software embedded in official databases, a program designed to automatically modify dates and times in judicial and forensic records. It was a system that ran invisibly and autonomously, rewriting the time of cases so no one could detect at a glance. The sophistication of that program left me breathless. It was a very embodiment of the manipulation we sensed, a much more dangerous mechanism because it operated without the need for constant supervision, hidden at the heart of the machinery of power. And there, in that moment, I understood that our battle was not against a single man or a single group, but against a wide and heavy network, an almost organic tangle that consumed the truth and shaped it to its own will. Trying to untangle that tangle seemed an infinite task, as vast as the darkest night. But the small clue we had, the stop clock, remained the key that held us up amidst the confusion. It was a lantern lit in a shipwreck, perhaps weak, but indispensable. The pressure among us reached a critical point. Those who remained on the team seemed to carry a double mask. On one side a calm, professional face, on the other a collection of mental ecosystems seeking to survive the avalanche of distrust and danger. I knew some considered leaving. Others perhaps had already done so quietly, but I refused to yield, because this was a story that had to be told, the truth that remained silent, and that could bring justice to Esteban and many others whose stories have been buried under the weight of manipulative oblivion. It was then that I received a message that shook what little was left intact of our security, a file with images captured by a hidden camera inside one of the judicial offices. The video showed a conversation between high-ranking officials and members of companies linked to digital disinformation, detailing new plans to expand the manipulation of evidence. The harshness of that material made clear that our enemy was not only powerful but ruthlessly creative, always one step ahead, always a master in the art of lies disguised as truth. The blow was fierce. The threat persisted and renewed itself. The feeling that every advance we made would be countered by forces equally or more intense seemed to paint a grim future. And yet, amid that internal and external storm, I never forgot what Esteban had taught me in that silent share with the stop clock, that the truth, although it walks clumsily, always has an echo, and that echo can reverberate louder than any attempt to silence it. The nights grew long. Sleep became a luxury slipping through nervous fingers and persistent thoughts. Sometimes I found myself talking to nothingness, as if looking for an invisible interlocutor to release fear and frustration. But I always returned to the clock, imagining its still hands, giving me time that no one else could offer, time to keep resisting and not let the system erase Esteban and all he represented. One early morning, I decided to walk through the wet streets of Santiago. The cold wind struck my face, and the city seemed to sleep under a blanket of yellow lights and deep shadows. I thought about all the people who had been victims of that silent machinery, their faces hidden behind piles of papers, their stories seemingly doomed to disappear forever. But I also thought that each of us, even the smallest details, could play a crucial role in building the truth. I then remembered something fundamental. We were not alone. No matter how invisible and omnipresent the enemy seemed, there were other invisible warriors, like us, fighting from different trenches, who listened to those same intermittent tickings of stop clocks in 1,000 places. And that idea gave me renewed strength. The certainty that this story, though fragmented, did not end here. There was a flame that had to stay alive so that someday, when time was just, the truth could come to light in all its complexity. But the truth is that I cannot tell you how all this will end. I do not have a clear ending, a perfect conclusion. What I do know is that as long as there's a stop clock waiting to be heard, as long as there are silent stories demanding justice, we will be there, alert, resisting with every irregular tick, trying to ensure that the relentless march called justice does not stop. Because even if the path is uncertain, there is no greater act of courage than continuing to pursue the truth, even when it seems hidden in the darkest corners of time. So, friend, if you ever find yourself in front of a stop clock, do not ignore it. Do not leave it in silence. Remember that slow ticking can be the heartbeat of a story that deserves to be told. A story of struggle, betrayal, sacrifice, but above all, hope. And even though time can be manipulated, even though they try to erase our memory, as long as there is at least one person willing to listen, the truth will always have a place. There will always be a rhythm, though uneven, to which we must pay attention. Do not lose faith in that search, because even if everything seems stopped, time and justice always find a way to start moving again. And when they do, that march will be a powerful, resounding echo, a truth that no one will be able to silence. That is a legacy Esteban leaves us. That is a commitment I now carry with me. A commitment I invite you to share. Because in this story, as in so many others, justice is not just an ideal. It is the sum of every small gesture, every watchful gaze, every tick, irregular as it may seem, that decides not to give up. That walk in the freezing rain was more than just a simple pause. It was a moment to reorganize thoughts, to prepare the body for what I sensed was approaching, something that could change not only the course of our investigation, but also the lives of those around us. And indeed, I was not wrong. The following days brought with them a series of events that, one after another, shook the foundations of everything we believed solid. First, an anonymous email arrived with information that seemed taken from the most elaborate conspiracy novel. Names, dates, locations, and even proof of financial transfers between individuals who, until that moment, seemed untouchable. But it was not just a document with data. It was confirmation of our darkest suspicions, a clear depiction of a network that used the system as both weapon and shield. We realized that every move, every delay or advance in judicial processes, every testimony presented, had been carefully orchestrated to fit the official story, one that didn't even allow uncomfortable questions. At first, the team was divided. Some were skeptical, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been uncovered, and others, myself included, experienced a strange mix of fear and a determination that seemed unbreakable. There was something almost hypnotic in that fine line between knowing we were treading on minefield and the responsibility to move forward with slow but steady steps. We had to proceed cautiously, as if every word and every action could be the spark that ignited that dangerous ecosystem of hidden corruption. Every night, we reviewed documents and analyzed videos over and over, searching for patterns, looking for that tiny error that always exists in the most complex lies. Aware of the need to protect our sources, we created secure channels to share information and began building a network of scattered allies who, though distant, were equally determined to fight that silent empire of falsehoods. The feeling of loneliness diminished only for a few moments when we saw that we were not the only ones watching that stop clock and refusing to accept it as an accident. But it was not all investigation and conspiracy. There were moments when the tension reached unbearable levels. I remember one especially dark early morning when the team received veiled threats, coded messages that made it clear someone was monitoring every one of our moves. That night, returning home, I found a small envelope slipped under the door without sender or mark. Inside, a sheet with just one sentence. Time can stop, but the truth can bury you. That threat hit like a punch to the stomach. Because although we already knew the danger, reading it in such direct words reminded us how close we were to the edge. Still, far from paralyzing us, that warning became an additional push to move forward. Because we understood that that very fear was a tool they wanted to use to silence us, to make us accept the stop clock as a simple accident, another closed case. But we could not and did not want to do that. We had heard the interrupted heartbeat of that story and, in a way, had committed ourselves to it, rooting ourselves in the conviction that, even slowly, the rhythm would sound again. Then came the unexpected twist that would change our perspective on this entire web. One night, thanks to a source I prefer to keep anonymous to protect them, we received a physical location of a server hidden outside the reach of official systems, a place where unaltered copies of all records and videos related to the tampered cases were stored. It was our direct access to unfiltered truth, but also a potential trap. No one knew for sure if the facility had cameras, recorders, or if its owners were waiting to intercept the information. However, that night it was very clear. It was our chance, and we could not let doubt or fear paralyze us. We organized a small expedition, a trusted, reduced group, to access that place. Preparation was meticulous and no detail was left to chance. Encrypted communication devices, equipment to record every step, and strict protocols to prevent any possible leak. Upon arrival, the feeling was a mix of anxiety and curiosity, like opening a safe after years of unanswered questions. The atmosphere in the dim place where the server was located was dense, the silence absolute, broken only by the faint electric hum of the machines running relentlessly. Accessing the files, what we found was more devastating and revealing than I could have ever imagined. Not only were the altered record of Esteban and other cases there, but also documents directly linking judicial officials, police officers, and businessmen in networks of corruption spanning decades. It was a systemic web, a multi-layered truth that showed how power had manipulated time and death to protect itself. Some files contained recordings of phone conversations outlining strategies to discredit witnesses and fabricate evidence. The evidence was as clear as it was terrifying, and the magnitude of what we had in our hands left us breathless. But it was there, among those digital folders, that another piece of data appeared that again changed everything. A record of the stop clock itself, a kind of digital log that had escaped the reach of malicious software. That file showed that the clock had indeed been altered by someone at the scene, that the time it stopped did not match the supposed time of death. It was a sharp and undeniable confirmation that the accident had been manipulated to cover up a much darker truth, a murder disguised as a fatal accident. The silence that followed that discovery was heavy, almost unbearable. We knew that from that point, no lie could stand without falling. But we also knew the cost of exposing that truth was extremely high. The pieces had begun to move in a way that allowed no turning back. It was a moment when everyone had to answer to their own conscience, decide whether we belonged to those who resign themselves or those who fight to uncover reality. Even if that fight seemed lost from the start, with the weight of that responsibility, We realized that Esteban's story and his stop clock were not just an isolated case, but the visible tip of a corrupt iceberg that had kept a country on edge, stealing hope from those waiting for justice. We closed the session on the server with more questions and answers, but with a firm conviction that the next phase of that battle was in our hands. To make that truth public, find a way to confront the system that wanted to silence us. There are moments in life, my friend, when reality surpasses any fiction and forces you to stare into the abyss. This was one of those moments. But I also learned that even in the midst of the darkest darkness, a small thread can guide to the light. And that thread, in our case, was precisely Esteban's clock, stopped but not silent, patiently waiting for someone to listen and understand its message. If there's one thing I take from all this, it is that truth is not black or white. It is not a linear or safe path. It is a constant struggle, a permanent vigilance, an act of faith. And it is also a reminder that behind every story that seems forgotten, there's always a hidden heartbeat, a stop clock that refuses to remain mute. That is why I repeat to you, never ignore a stop clock. That frozen moment in time may be etched into the skin of a story that deserves to be told, that deserves someone brave enough to face fear, to challenge silence, and to walk that tortuous path opening between lies and justice. I don't know how this story will end, nor if the clock will ever tick again in sync with the rest of the world. But I know that as long as there is even one willing to listen, the truth can never be completely buried. Because in the end, that irregular tick-tock will be the signal, the call that invites others to join this endless struggle, to not resign themselves, to never allow stop clocks to fall silent. And perhaps, in that unstable rhythm, we will finally find a pulse that restores meaning to time, justice, and memory.